We would like to acknowledge the Yagara people and the Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of Mianjin, the lands in which we record this podcast today. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging.
Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Hey everyone, welcome to For the Health It podcast, a Healthcare Australia podcast.
Made for healthcare professionals by nurses on the inside. My name is Jess.
And I'm Xana, and we have such an amazing episode for you today. We are speaking with Dr Sonia Henry. Me and Jess both know her personally, so we've spoken to her previously about so many issues to do with her career as a doctor, her career as an author. She wrote this amazing book called Going Under, which basically gives a snapshot into the real life of what it is like to be an intern on the floor in Australia. It has some really raw, emotional, heavy-hitting topics which are, very relatable to us as nurses and what we see both in our careers and also what we see in, doctors that we work with. This chat is pretty emotional and pretty confronting. It's a lot about mental health, indigenous health, but then there's some hilarious elements in there too because Sonia Henry is just such a breath of fresh air.
I
and
love
her passion for life and her passion for medicine and her passion for remote and rural health, is huge, and it's inspiring, and this chat just left us with so many giggles, and we hope that you guys have some giggles too. It's so great. She's awesome, and we just can't wait for you guys to get to know her a little bit better. And if you want to go buy her book, it's Going Under. We'll put the link in the show notes. Go buy it because as any healthcare professional, you will relate to this book so deeply, and it's one of the first books or only books Jess has ever cried in. So
yeah, I don't read a lot of books, and this is the one book that really got me. So I really loved it. It was very emotional. Just because it was so raw and honest of what it's like working in the health world. And we love talking with Sonia because we get along so well with our lifestyles. Xana and I have both been travel nurses within Healthcare Australia and agency nurses as well. We love that lifestyle. We just thrive on that lifestyle. And so does Sonia. She, Dr. Sonia literally travels around Australia doing locum doctor work, and it's just the best lifestyle. Yeah. She's like half here, half Europe, half everywhere. But it's just such a good balance. Yeah. So we love her.
And for anyone that knows, or has worked in metro areas and then rural and remote, that it's so different in how not only the cultures work, but like the, workplace environments. Like cities are so go, hustle, hustle, hustle all the time. People are always on the go. People aren't really, looking introspectively as much.
Yeah, they're not like as present.
Yeah.
I think, when you're metro, you're not really present in the moment with your patient or kind of what's going on.
Yeah, whereas rurally, you really get to know yourself. You really know what the environment's like. You get to know the culture. You have to know the culture to be able to work in these environments, and it really makes you look internally and kind of grow as a person, which is awesome, and what we speak about with Sonia in this podcast. We also have started the segment called Workplace Wobbles. So if you guys have any workplace wobbles, embarrassing, funny, hilarious, silly stories that have happened while you've been working in any kind of workplace environment, please send them through because we're going to be sharing those and also sharing ours each week as well. So share your workplace wobble with us today.
Okay, so mine's a little bit of a kind of disgusting one. Only because when you're a medical, sometimes it is quite gross. Yeah. I was on call, so I was doing a theatre placement in rural New South Wales, and I was on call a lot. So we were all going out for dinner, and I didn't want to say no because I was like, I'm on call. It's a very small town, so it's like the restaurant's here and the hospital's right here. So I was like, let's go out for dinner, and obviously if I get called in, I'll go straight to the hospital. So I ordered the squid there is so good. So I ordered squid, chips, and salad. It came out, my phone rang. So I chucked it straight into a takeaway container, straight to the hospital, and it was an emergency gastroscopy because somebody had eaten some food and was choking on it basically, and it got stuck. So set everything up. We get the chunk of food out of the patient, pop it on the table, and I look at it, and it's the exact same squid that I was eating.
No.
It was.
How do you know?
And it was the same restaurant. So we asked her, and she's like, yeah, it was squid from this restaurant. I was like, wow.
No
and then I
way.
got my container out of the fridge and I put it next to it and I said, it's the exact same squid.
And you threw it in the bin?
Yeah, I threw it in the bin, and I threw mine in the bin too. I gave mine away to another nurse. She's like, I'll eat it. I don't care. I'm not grossed out by it. And I was like, I'm grossed out by that. I'm not eating it. I'll get something else for dinner.
Wow. I have my workplace bubble now just after that, and it's to do with things coming out of people's esophaguses or wherever tracheas wherever they end up. So I was looking after a patient and they were tubed and they'd come in and they'd, choked on something and they'd come into hospital and they'd been tubed and they were in ICU, and then we're doing suctioning because you do suctioning very regularly in ICU. Was using the inline suction, and out comes some green beans through the inline suction. There's just green beans in his lungs.
In the lungs?
Yeah. Straight down. Right in there.
Wow.
Yep.
So how were they already tubed when they were choking?
Well, they obviously were just full down there, and they were ventilating him, obviously not very well. And, yeah, some green beans came out the inline suction. They actually didn't come through the inline suction. You couldn't get them out because they were too big. So then they had to do an endoscopy in there.
That's hilarious. Well, yeah, in that space, in that area that I was doing like all those gastroscopies, so many of them were people just not chewing their food.
Yep.
Like guys eating a steak sandwich really quick and then it getting stuck. And I'm like, dude, just chew a little bit more and then swallow and then it won't get
I can't even think of a Porto the same because we had one guy that choked eating a Porto chicken. And I just, every time I think of it, I just think of him choking.
Well, there you go, guys. Yeah. That's our workplace bubbles. And Sonia shares a workplace bubble in the podcast episode 2 at the end, and it is so funny. So you have to listen to the end of the episode because it is so hilarious. And while you're at it, once you've listened to the episode, give us a 5-star review, please.
Yes, please do. It's just up the top on Spotify. You just have to listen to a little bit of the podcast first and then give us a rating. And also, if you would love to, go onto YouTube and like us and follow us there as well.
And Apple Podcasts.
And Apple Podcasts, everywhere. Just everywhere, please.
Everywhere.
And we also are the people who answer everything on social media. So if you have any questions, please send them straight through and we'll be the ones to answer them directly. We hope you have an amazing Christmas and festive season and enjoy this podcast.
Bye.
Bye. Hey everyone, we are now joined with Sonia Henry and this is such an amazing episode. We can't wait for you guys to hear it. We have talked to Dr. Sonia Henry before and we just love everything that she does. She is a travel doctor. She has an amazing book. She's an author. She is just everything that we all aspire to be, and she's just doing everything, all of everything. So please just tell us a little bit about you, who you are, how you ended up in this place, and tell us everything about it.
Hi guys, that's very kind of you to say all of those nice things. I don't really feel that great, but I guess, I think I'm more of the self-deprecating end than an egomaniac, which is, I suppose, a spectrum for most doctors. So I was a physio for a few years before I became a doctor, and then I did my training in Sydney, and I did my internship and residency at St Vincent's in Darlinghurst, so right in the inner city. And I worked there in private hospitals and as a surgical assistant, as a GP registrar for a good few years. Then a few things happened and I wanted to go to Europe to sort of escape and work, and I'd lined up my Irish registration to actually work in Dublin. And then, as we all know, the big COVID hit and they shut the international borders. So my next best option was going to, I didn't really think about it too much, actually. I just took a job in the middle of the Pilbara region of Western Australia as the only doctor for about 350 kilometres. And that was the beginning, I guess, of my next 3 years, which I've spent working in very rural and remote parts of Australia, and I've seen almost the entire country. So, it's been wild, and I've written my next book about it, which is coming out next year with Alan and Unwin.
Oh, it's so exciting. I love watching your adventures, and that's kind of like how we're so similar, because you were doing your locum doctor work all over Australia, and Xana and I were traveling Australia as, kind of locum travel nurses. So it's just like the best lifestyle, isn't it, to be able to sign a contract in somewhere brand new, you've never been there before, and you get to go and experience such... just like meet, like even when you're in like tiny communities, like you feel a part of the community when you get to go into these regions as well. Whereabouts?
And you connect with people. Like I said, when I saw you guys' profiles, I felt very similar because I knew that we were doing similar things, and certain types of people explore the way, I guess, we're nomads, or we have wanderlust, I suppose, and I always find people like that are really nice, most of them, and they're really open to new experiences and meeting new people and learning new things and changing, which I think without change we may as well just cease to be. So I understand those similarities.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
So what's the difference between working like in a doctor, say in Sydney? Obviously it's very different to then going into doing your locum style work. Obviously you're addicted to the lifestyle you've got now. Can you tell us a little bit about the pros and cons of kind of taking that leap? Like if there's any doctors kind of listening to this and they're like, I'd love to do that leap and kind of do locum work, but that sounds so scary.
Look, you have to be quite hardy, I must say, particularly in the early days. You have to be very flexible and adaptable. So if you're the kind of person who doesn't like change and who doesn't like chaos, I mean, look, no one loves chaos to a point, I guess, because it's scary and frightening, particularly medically as a doctor or a nurse. But you will have those experiences where you don't have access to major hospitals, specialists and that kind of thing. So if that's something that you just know within yourself you're not going to be able to handle, I wouldn't recommend it. But also I think, to be honest, it's really important for doctors in Australia to face those things, or nurses, because that is the reality of our country. Sydney and Brisbane don't represent the rest of Australia. The Eastern Seaboard and Perth and cities that hug the coastline aren't the rest of Australia. So if you're working as a doctor only in a metropolitan area, you're really only seeing a very small part of the country in which you profess to be a medical professional. Yeah.
And I know a lot of careers, and especially medicine and nursing, in your studies, a lot of the time that they recommend, or they kind of push you a little bit to do these rural placements, or make the rural jobs easier to get, because they need staff there, but also two, like, it broadens your experience, your connection to Australia, and also helps you in your profession as well. So it's something that all the professions are kind of leading you towards, but no one really wants to leave their like little safety net, and they don't really want to take that step. Yeah, it's a hard one.
And I understand that. I mean, I do understand that. And had my life been different, had the things that happened to me not happened, then I probably would have just stayed in Sydney or gone to Europe. So, I mean, I'm certainly not trying to be preachy, I guess, because for me it was an accident of fate how I ended up where I did. But since I've learnt the things that I've learnt, I have to say I am a very passionate advocate for supporting remote medicine. Look, you don't have to do what I do. You don't have to be a total nomad, but you can certainly do. I mean, GP friends of mine who live in the eastern suburbs of Sydney spend 1 month a year working in the Kimberley. And it's those kind of things that I would really recommend, and I think are really fantastic. So, again, there's a spectrum. You can be a complete nomad for 5 years of your life, make very good money and see the whole country.
Oh, yeah.
Or you can have a very comfortable life and quite a safe life in Sydney, but you can do the odd locum work and see different and learn different things. So, you can do it all, really, if you want to.
So good. Exactly. And what are the other perks, I guess, of doing locum? I know obviously it's the money. You get a significant increase in how much you kind of get given. You also have like travel and accommodation included.
Yeah, I mean, people often think that people go out to the bush for the money, but to be honest, if you work at a privately billing practice in a city, you'll make good money too. It's just, I suppose, you get a guaranteed salary, like as in you get a guaranteed daily rate, which is high, and that is helpful. And you also attract remote bonuses if you work in the right places for long enough. So yes, there is an element of finance. You're certainly not going to be poor working in remote areas. It's also fun because, on the weekend, instead of just going to the same pub you always go to, next minute you find yourself kayaking along Lake Argyle and hiking through waterfalls and getting helicopters over King George Falls and partying on Cable Beach in Broome, and you're meeting people who own cattle stations. You're becoming friends and going fishing with indigenous people who live and work with the land. It's just amazing. It changed my life. It changed the way I see myself. It changed the way I see my country. It was the best thing that I ever did. And I would really, really recommend it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also with that, you saying that it improved you as a person, it improved your perspective on the world. I think a lot of people, especially if you do kind of stay in these metro areas, there is a lot of kind of hierarchy, especially in the medical world and in medicine, that there's kind of these clashes that happen that obviously cause a lot of strain on your mental health and in your personal health and all that as well. So even taking that step kind of to find yourself in the rural space will only help your mental health as well, and maybe is something that, if people are feeling super overwhelmed and stressed in a city environment, could do to kind of get back to the ground of why they chose to do medicine in the first place. So how do you kind of navigate, I guess, that mental health side and keeping your mental health a priority, through your medicine and through, this journey?
Well, I mean, I guess for me, seeing the Pilbara region of Western Australia, I found incredibly therapeutic. I wasn't in the best headspace at the time, which I sort of go a bit more into my book, but I don't really discuss that now. But the point is that suddenly I was in this space that was so ancient and so old and so beautiful and startling that I actually felt a connection to the land that I had never felt before. And I recently discussed this with an indigenous friend of mine who's incredibly intelligent and runs a museum in central New South Wales. And he said that, even being white, he said people need to connect to the outside before they can connect to the inside. And I really felt that in a way that I find it hard to articulate, actually. Like, I find when you are in a place where you're surrounded by nothing but silence and land and sky and ocean, if wherever you are, it is extremely therapeutic, and it forces you to understand yourself and know yourself, which is quite hard to do when you're surrounded by people and things happening all the time in cities. And it's a very personal sort of thing because you become very self-reliant and you realise that actually you can survive anywhere. And also the good thing is even if your work is quite difficult, working remotely, it's often you're on your own, it's hard. With contract work, you can stop and then you can go and have a 2-week holiday on the beach in Broome and, fantastic. Like, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, exactly. And you're constantly in Europe. Like,
yeah.
I never know where you are. And I'm like, oh, look, Sonia's in Europe now. Now she's here.
I move around.
Do you have a home? Like, do you have anywhere that there's a house or no?
I do have an apartment in Sydney, but it's sort of funny that you should say that because in my book I do talk about the concept of home, and a lot of people asked me when I travelled around Australia, where is your home? And I remember sitting in Broome and an elderly Indigenous man used to come and sit with me every lunchtime at the cafe that I sat at, and he said, "Sister, where are you from?" And at the time I said, at the moment I think I'm from Broome. And he just sat there and we just had lunch together. And then I realised now that once you do truly know yourself, home is actually just wherever you are. Mm-hmm. And most people do not have that capacity for self-awareness, but you have to force yourself into quite different situations, I think, to get to that point.
Definitely. And I remember when Jess was traveling, it's just the funniest story is wherever she goes, we get it all the time. Where are you from? Where's your family from? Mm-hmm. And you're like, nowhere. And they're like, well, where does your mail go? Yeah. Like, where does your mail go? It's like,
quite difficult, isn't it?
I know. It's difficult.
Understanding of how awful it is for people who are genuinely homeless, because even when you're just travelling around, there's almost discrimination you face for things like, well, where do we send you this? And this bill that hasn't arrived. And what do you mean you don't have an address? And we've been living the last 5 years and suddenly feel this sense of constantly explaining yourself. Well, I sort of move around a bit, and it changes, again, your perspective. Yeah.
So such a hard
They would
question
always
to
say
answer.
the mail thing, and I would be like, I'm like, what mail do you get that's important? And they're like, like your Red Joe, and I was like, it gets emailed to me. And they're like your bills. I'm like, they get emailed to me. And I'm like, and I go, to be honest, I haven't had an address for so long that I'm not missing whatever's coming at me. Like,
yeah.
Or like, can you just send it to me via the email, please?
Yes.
And then they're like, you have to fill out some form, and you're like.
It's one of the cons, hey?
Yeah.
One of the cons
so
of
funny.
being a nomad. I've definitely felt it. I've been in Brisbane for a year now, so it's like I've actually got a home. I've got an address now, which is
for the
wild.
first time.
Amazing. I use my parents' address.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it's so funny. So I would love to dive in a little bit about, so you've got a book out, obviously, Going Under. Xana and I are huge fans of the book, and I explained to you when I spoke to you last time that I'm not a reader at all, and that was one of the only books I've been able to actually read front to back. Like, within 2 days I read that book, and I was just like, this is the best book ever. I didn't even know you could cry in books.
Yeah.
I know this sounds funny because I don't read, right? So I know in a movie you watch something and, you cry in a scene. I didn't know you could physically cry reading a book. And I did. I cried. And I was like, this is so raw and real. Mm-hmm. And I love the book so much. Can we talk about how you started that book? Because you actually had posted an article online that was an anonymous article. Can you go through kind of that journey?
Yeah, I mean, I always wanted to write books. Like, people say, oh, when they were a small child or whatever, what did you want to be or, whatever. And people talk about playing with their toy stethoscopes and all this sort of thing. That was never me. I always wanted to be a writer. My whole life I wanted to write books. So, my journey towards that was kind of interesting because I became a physio, then I became a doctor. But I never let go of that part of myself, which was that I wanted to write. And I, wrote 2 books before I got my first book published. One of them nearly got published but didn't. Publishing's very, luck, timing, lots of things. And I used to write articles when I felt particularly passionately about a subject, and the hospital I trained at, there'd been a series of suicides through New South Wales of junior doctors, one of whom had worked where I had worked, and I thought it had been handled very poorly. I felt that the system we were working in was very unfair. I thought it was wrong that young, talented people who could contribute to society in such a meaningful way were killing themselves. It was horrific. And I got home one night from a shift, and on my iPhone I wrote an article and I sent it to a blog in America, and then it went viral. And, I wrote it anonymously, one, because I was scared of the hospital, but two, because I knew that as soon as I put my name to it, everyone would target me and say whether doctors are it's very competitive. She shouldn't have written that because she was just a resident, or she doesn't know, she doesn't. And so I thought, if I speak for as no one, I can sort of speak for everyone. And it worked. And I'm very proud I wrote that article. It took a lot of courage, and I don't really know how I did it. And since then, a lot of books have been written, and often people forget, actually, that it was that initial article that sort of set it all off in Australia. And that's not something I talk about a lot because I sort of disappeared for 3 years. But actually, it was me who started that conversation, and I'm very proud of myself for doing that.
Yeah, I was proud of you. As soon as I knew that it was you that had done that article, I knew about that article when it first got released. So when I put it together and I realised, that book as well was, because you were in the middle of writing that book when that was happening, or was it after?
No. I sort of started writing a book, and I was, writing down stories, but I didn't really have it together. And writing a book, I'm what I would call, I'm a bit of a binge drinker, but I'm also a binge writer. Not that I'm recommending that medically, that was a joke. So I'd sort of write and write and write when I felt I was getting lucky with something, but then work would get in the way, or I'd have a rejection from an agent, or, and so then I'd not write for a year or two. So it's sort of, I suppose I'm always writing something, but at the time I wrote that article, I had a book in mind, but I hadn't really, it wasn't formulated into a book, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, that article definitely that aligned very well with your book, because obviously it was very...
Yes, and my publishers used that to help promote the book, which I didn't mind. By then I was out of the hospital system, so, fair enough. I wanted to sell books, and, I'm quite pragmatic at heart. Plus, by then I was like, well, I've really shown my hand, so I may as well face up to it.
Can you tell us a little bit about Going Under?
Yeah, it just follows the story of an intern at a major Sydney hospital that is based loosely on my life and, stories I'd heard, and it follows the highs and the lows. And I wanted to capture, I didn't want it to be a PC book about how much she loved the job and helping people. I wanted it to show things like alcohol abuse, drugs, failed sexual encounters, love, friendship, abuse. Yeah, I wanted to show all of that. Difficulties between doctors, relationships, and also with nurses. I really tried to be as honest as I could rather than pander to any particular audience. Yeah.
You was very honest, yeah.
You did great. I was in tears. I laughed. I was just like, this is a great book.
Yeah.
Very, very relatable.
Yeah, very relatable.
And what's your new book? Tell us a little bit more about that.
I still don't have a title yet. I'm actually having lunch with my publisher next week. But I suppose the theme of it is, in the middle of nothing, you can find anything. And it's a bit of a coming-of-age story in a way that, I wasn't in the best headspace emotionally, and I dropped myself in the middle of the Western Australian desert, and it's all about what happens next. And it's not just about, remote health. It's about finding yourself, I guess, and the concept of home. Talks a lot about indigenous health, about, the discrepancies in not only remote and metropolitan Australia, but indigenous and white Australia. And it also is a lot about friendship and meeting people that you otherwise would never have met had I not gone to those places. Yeah.
Well, I can't wait to get my hands on that. End of 2023.
Lots of drinking, lots of swearing.
Oh, yes. It's a real raw book. Yeah. I cannot wait.
I would love to know more, a little bit more about why you love Indigenous health and how that kind of has progressed and grown for you, and what is so special about it for you, and what is, I guess, your passion and your goals for working in that space?
I suppose I've always been a bit of a social justice advocate, but to be honest, my mother's Ukrainian, so as we all know, that there's very unfortunate things going on in Ukraine at the moment. But so I was always a bit more interested in the Eastern European side, which is not well known generally. I had an awareness of the gap and the state of Indigenous health in Australia, but I didn't know much about it aside from what I learned at uni, which is that topic on Indigenous health or that kind of thing. And then when I saw the reality of the gap, I was appalled, actually, and I was ashamed. I was deeply affected by the things that I saw, the diseases that are still present in the centre of Australia, and also the incredibly fantastic Indigenous people that I now consider to be close friends, and the lack of access to things that I take for granted that they did not have, despite the fact that we are of equal intelligence, of equal ability to go forth and do things in our lives, but they have not been given those opportunities. And I was also horrified by, I think, the still very deep-seated racism that permeates Australian society, which is really unfortunate. And the other thing I think that I learned was there's a lot of tokenism, like particularly in cities. You see a lot of, sorry, there's a lawnmower going off outside. You see a lot of people talking about acknowledgement of country and, you know, that sort of thing, but they've never been to those places. They've never met Indigenous people, and they sort of see it as this us and them, whereas I don't see it like that. My Indigenous friends are my friends, regardless of whether I'm white and they're black. It's just that they have faced hardships that we can't comprehend, I don't think. Yeah.
Yeah. It's such an important space, and a reason why we love doing travel nursing as well, the people you meet, the things you see, the different cultures you see. It's like when you travel overseas, you know, you go to these different countries and you see that the way people live these different cultures, and it's not something you ever thought you would do, or you may never do, but it's still like it's important to them, and it's something that's very deep rooted in their culture and their society, and it's something that we all can learn from. Every single culture we can learn from. Yeah. I think it's amazing to, you know, give yourself to that space because it's so important.
Yeah, especially in the Australian space.
What I don't realise is that Aboriginal people are extremely funny a lot of the time, and they're very, very talented and artistic. I mean, you don't want to generalise, but across the board, you know, I have been taught, if you actually let yourself be taught things by Indigenous people in Australia rather than sort of telling them, just letting them teach you, you discover things about the country and about yourself and the land. And I go into this in my book. It's quite amazing. And, you know, I spoke to a good friend recently who lives in central New South Wales, and he said, you know, in the end, Sonia, we're all just looking for our way home. And I thought that was a very nice way of putting it. And he's Indigenous, and just the incredible way that they understand culture and land and how they integrate the land with their lives is phenomenal. And I have enormous respect for that. And I think a lot of people don't truly understand that because they simply haven't been there, which I don't blame them for, but that's what's so great about working as a GP in rural and remote areas.
Yeah, for sure.
I think everything aligned really well when obviously the sea came in, and you didn't go overseas because you would have never kind of been exposed to this space, and like the passion that's just like oozing out of you right now, like I absolutely love it, and I want more people to be exposed to this and actually put themselves in these environments and then fall in love with these communities and actually want to help and close the gap. Of course, as well.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's, you know, like I said, it's not just, you can feel passionately about certain things in medicine and you can feel angry and you can feel all of these things. And at the same time, you can appreciate the great beauty across Australia and the contradictions that exist in the country that we call home. And it's an amazing place. And I didn't appreciate that until I put my feet in the dirt, so to speak.
Yeah. That's so great.
So good. I love this.
It's been such a great episode. But before we head off, we have to go into the workplace wobbles. So this is a segment we're going to be starting for you guys, and it's going to be something in each episode that is a hilarious story or a funny story or an embarrassing story that's happened in a healthcare setting. And we need to get your workplace wobble, Sonia, before you head off.
Well, there's two dog-related ones, but I think I might do the first one. It's quite amusing. So my first job ever in Western Australia, one of the nurses who was really fantastic, she's one of the best nurses I've worked with, she had this hole in her leg that had been there for, you know, months.
Oh.
And I was sort of like, they'd sort of been trying to debride it, and some wound nurse had looked at it, and I was like, no. And like this, my Sydney person medicine was really like, this is no good. You need to see like a plastic surgeon or something. Anyway, it turns out she'd been bitten by a dog by one of the other workplace members because that was a bit awkward. Anyway, I swabbed this wound and it came back with this bizarre bacteria like only found in the mouths of dogs. Anyway, so I looked it up And I was like, wow, I think you've got this weird like zoonotic infection. And so then I started thinking, you know, because I was out in literally the middle of nowhere. Like, no, we were talking like nowhere. And I was sort of like, I could write a paper about this, you know, like I've got a bit of time out here. I could really. And so then I was reading these other studies they'd had on this bacteria. You have to swab the mouth of the dog to sort of, and so anyway, then I was thinking, well, how do I process the swab? Like, do dogs have Medicare? Can I send it to a human lab? Like this went on for days. Anyway, finally I rang the vet in the nearest sort of city miles away. And they said, look, we can send you these special dog swabs. And so I received these swabs, and then one day I get to work, and at 4:30 p.m. this is an appointment. So it's like, you know, Jack Jones, blah, 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 you know, names of appointments. Then at 4:30 it just says dog. And so the dog comes in, and it was so aggressive I couldn't do the swab. And the owner, I said, I just don't think we can do it. It's too aggressive. And he said, oh, it's all right. I'm having a general anaesthetic next week, so we can do the swab then. I said, oh, is it having an operation? And he said, no, it's getting his hair cut. And I was like, your dog has a general haircut. What? Anyway, so I remember I gave up on it. I was just like, but there was this moment where I was sort of like, I can't believe I have actually spent I had written a book that had been a bestseller. You know, I'd been having drinks in Sydney with publishers and all sorts of, you know, sort of high flyers. And then I was sitting in a tin clinic in the middle of the Western Australian desert, seriously considering how to swab this dog's mouth. Like
the contrast, major contrast.
Yeah, it was ridiculous.
I'm sad that you never got the swab done.
Yeah,
I know, and I still think about it. And I actually did sort of put that in my book because I do think there was one of my near medical, you know, achievements that alas went nowhere, but that's okay.
I can't wait to read that in the book.
No wonder the dog gave the person a bite. It was too aggressive for the mouth swab.
I did sort of, you know, but then I just was like, I don't want to make things even more awkward, so I just sort of left it.
Oh,
but,
my gosh. That's great.
I did not expect that.
Classic. Oh, there's nowhere else than in a rural area that you bring your dog into a GP clinic.
I know.
I've also taken blood sugar of another dog because we thought it was diabetic and the vet wasn't available. And I did actually at one point look into some, because my grandfather was a vet, some dog medicine, because apparently in some of these areas they cannot get vets. And so they train GPs into doing things like emergency animal care. And I still would consider doing that because I really love animals and I particularly like dogs. So, yeah.
Wow.
That would be an amazing step in your career. That's so cool.
I know like in a rural space as a GP, you can kind of do extra qualifications, do like an anesthetics, or you can do like, I know, obstetrics. And I never knew that until I went into like those rural communities. I was like, wow, you're a GP, but you also can deliver babies and you can also put people to sleep. That's crazy. But to also be then a side vet.
Well, I'm just a run-of-the-mill GP, but I would love to be a dog GP as well because I just love dogs.
Wow.
So,
this job can take you anywhere.
Yeah, stay tuned. Dr. Sonia Henry, now vet. A vet GP.
So good. Well, we can't wait to read that in the book. Yep. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you so much for coming on For the Health of It podcast.
Yes, it's been so great.
Oh, no, thanks, guys. It's really great to catch up again. We must try and catch up in person at some point on our travels.
Yes, I know. It's very hard to meet anyone, let alone all of us on our, travel journeys.
I know.
But we'll make it happen.
I understand the trials. But, it's been great. And, anyone has any questions and they go through you guys and you want to ask me, I'm perfectly happy to answer them.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.